Hello, my name is Nick Bowman. I'm an associate professor of communication studies here at West Virginia University. I'm here to talk to you about Chapter 3 from our textbook, An Introduction to Computer-Mediated Communication, a Functional Approach. Chapter 3 largely deals with the notion of understanding media as tools for a wide array of communication functions. Some of the things we'll cover in Chapter 3, what are some of the central debates concerning the relationship between people and machines? What do we mean when we say that we use media as a tool? How is this different than how we used to look at media? Why are uses and gratifications especially important when we are examining CMC? And are we inclined to think about CMC using the assumptions we use in face-to-face exchanges? And so these are some of the questions we want you to think about while you're reading Chapter 3 and going through some of these discussions. And of course, as I've been doing with most of these chapters, I want to stop for a moment and show you a couple of different questions. And before you continue on with this presentation, I want to make sure you've got an answer to these questions, or at least have these questions in your mind as sort of a reading check to make sure you're picking up on the key constructs from Chapter 3. I'll let you read these now, and whenever you're ready, go ahead and continue the presentation. Again, Chapter 3 is about media as a tool, and something I've always thought was rather interesting is this quote here is from a newspaper article in the 90s that was referring to the growth of the emerging growth of online communication. And a journalist pictured here, you can click on the eye icon to be taken to the actual article, but it was written by a reporter saying that he really thought the predictions of the computer were way out of hand. So in 1995, this reporter writes that no online database will ever replace a newspaper, no CD-ROM will ever replace a competent teacher, and no computer network will ever change the way government works. And while indeed it's not the case that we don't use newspapers, that we don't have teachers, and that we have a fundamentally new government, some of these prognostications are a bit incorrect. In fact, we do use online databases to get information instead of the newspaper in many situations. For those of you right now sitting at home, you're using a YouTube channel and a online repository on eCampus to take a class distance without having to necessarily be in my office in Morgantown. And of course, we've seen plenty of situations in recent history where people have used computer networks to change governments. The Arab Spring riots in the early parts of the 21st century, where people in Tunisia and Egypt were able to go to social media, express sort of discomfort, distrust, and outrage with their government structures, and we saw regimes toppled in the Middle East. Here in the United States of America, we've seen situations where the White House has begun to use online petitions and feedback systems in order to consider different types of legislation. And generally, I think the idea behind this article in 95 is that it was a bit of an oversimplistic and a bit of a naysayer approach to technology that's, in fact, in many ways was wrong. Media technologies are a tool for a lot of parts of our lives, not including the news, education, and government. In Chapter 3, we'll spend a bit of time talking about the different roles technology plays in our modern society and in our future. So how is that Newsweek article so far off? And one of the things we often talk about is what's called the Jetsons effect, where whenever we have a new technology, we assume that it's going to fundamentally change everything right away. And so we tend to overestimate what technologies can really do for us. And then we start to underestimate what they can do for us in the long term. The flying car. We assume that when there's a flying car, it's going to radically change transportation. And then when it doesn't do that immediately, we get disenfranchised. Some scholars refer to this as the hype cycle, by which a particular innovation or technology gets all this attention. We might think of something like Google Glass, which we'll talk about later on in the semester. It was supposed to change the way humans interact. There were some predictions that Google Glass would be worn by 18 million Americans by the end of the second decade here, the 21st century. In fact, they sold 20,000 units of these glasses, and they eventually dissipated into the background. What we see, and we've kind of already talked about this with Moore's law from our earlier chapters, is that technology changes exponentially. The capability of our communication technologies grows at an exponential rate. I think in my own lifetime, when I was an undergraduate student in the early 2000s, We rarely used email to communicate with our professors. I still registered for classes by the phone, or I would go to a computer terminal, but I wouldn't do it online at home. And I still checked my final semester grades by calling a telephone number. It was a 1-800 number I can call from the airport. In 2015, as I'm recording this lecture now, I talk with students via email on a daily basis. My students in this class right now, I'm discussing with a YouTube channel. They can watch my lecture online from anywhere in the world. And grades are available almost immediately when a professor submits them. And what's interesting about that is while those technologies change very quickly, the organizations that use them change very slowly. Because it was the case that when I was an undergrad in the early part of the 21st century, from 1999 to 2004, there was email systems in place, there were networks in place. All the things we do today were likely capable during those times. We just didn't have it publicly available yet. And so what ends up happening is people get super excited about the technologies. And then because it takes organizations longer to change than it does the technologies, we get disenfranchised and disappointed when the technologies don't change our lives. And then the irony of this is that later on, as the organizations do change, the technologies have already moved on, and so we sort of discredit technology and its contribution. And an example I always use is a number of folks talk about the failure of MySpace and how Facebook sort of defeated MySpace. And they're kind of ignoring the fact that without MySpace to introduce the idea of social networking, we would have never had Facebook as we have it today. And we'll talk about that here a little further as we go through the. And it's like we refer to the law of accelerating returns, right? When we talk about the law of accelerating returns, we're essentially saying that these payoffs don't happen right away, right? But they tend to develop over time. And so with the law of accelerating returns, we've seen adoption to where things are flat for a while, then we quickly pick them up, and then we quickly drop them back down again. And what's particularly interesting about accelerating returns is that they develop on each other. And so you have one return, and then a second return, and then a third return, and then a fourth return. MySpace develops, slows down, backs off. Facebook picks up the innovation, runs with it, develops, slows down, and then we get a next one, and then we get a next one, and then we get a next one, right? What's cool about this is that if you look at these charts, we actually see somewhat linear growth. But when we look at the individual charts, we actually see very much these exponential growth patterns. And there's a bit of a difficulty in how we really get our hands and grasp the way technology treats us. And as a result, we often tend to grossly over and underestimate technologies. I've already kind of given the example, technology changes quickly, and that change tends to engender skepticism. And we have to realize that these changes don't follow smooth lines. And if we can do that, we start to understand how to use these tools. Right in front of you here, you see in the far left, that's one of Mark Zuckerberg's very first web pages. He just has a yellow eye and some web links, and it's pretty ugly. And in general, what you've got going on here is just a kid trying to make a website. Nothing overly fancy going on in this situation. Okay? Moving from that, you've got MySpace. And the idea behind MySpace is it built on this generic notion of letting folks build web pages. So in the early 1990s, we had things like Angel Fire and other programs that let you build a website. And that was seen as particularly cool. For the first time in history, one could build a web page. One could actually build a page and put themselves online. And everybody thought that was going to change human communication. Well, what we ended up doing is building a bunch of silly websites like the one you see here. And people got disenfranchised and went, oh, well, it's just a bunch of worthless websites, and it's a bunch of kids making web databases, and nobody cares, right? Well, that idea of building a web page led to the idea of MySpace. And so MySpace was a situation where, you know what? With MySpace, now what you can do is actually have someone help you make the programming process easier. So you don't have to code and write and clone and store your own web pages. And it's free. And Everybody could have access to the internet and build their own pages, not just people who knew how to program and knew how to buy a web domain. And MySpace eventually grew, and people got used to it. At one point, it had several hundred million users. Eventually, the program kind of died out a little bit. The creator Tom here, Tom was everybody's friend. He went ahead and sold it on to another media company, and Facebook was born. And so Facebook built off of the sort of removal barriers that MySpace gave us, that is, making websites easier to code, easier to see, more universal, placing them in networks rather than individual websites. And MySpace built on the generic idea of the personal website. And now we have a program, Facebook, that we use today that currently has 1.2 billion users. And so the growth from the personal website to Facebook is rather linear. But the individual programs were quite exponential, with personal blogs and pages exploding and then dying off, and MySpace exploding and then dying off, and now Facebook exploding, and at this point is actually not really died off just yet. And if you want to read more about this, the little icon there will tell you about the law of accelerating returns. You see beginning, growth, maturity, dying, beginning, growth, maturity, dying, and we see these transition stages. And that's how we can understand technology's growth from these very small, exciting things to what it is today. The implications of these accelerating returns. Well, what we also see is technologies grow faster and faster. Personal websites took about, I might estimate sort of 4 to 5 to 6 years to really become kind of popular things. MySpace grew quickly, but not as fast as faster than personal websites. Facebook grew even more quickly than MySpace grew. Newer companies like Google Plus and Twitter, while not all of them have been successful, have grown very, very, very quickly. Growth is happening faster and faster and faster. We overestimate the benefits of our growth, and the thing that you will have to get used to as a technology user is you have to deal with it, right? You have to start dealing with this notion of how do we adopt technologies? How do we understand their tools and their functions in a society in which constantly sort of grows and rejects them? And one of the ways you might better understand technology is taking more of a global look at its history rather than studying one particular tool. Something that I'm always telling my students about is whenever you compare technologies, you may not want to be so quick to compare them one to each other, but instead understand what they reinvent, what they build off of, what they're going to. And if you're trying to find tomorrow's next great communication technology, you want to build off of what we've already built rather than trying to reconceptualize a quote unquote new thing, because it's not necessarily always new. Facebook wasn't new. It was MySpace repackaged. It was, personal blogs repackaged. Some examples: it took us nearly 4,000 years to go from writing things to printing things, from humans writing and humans typing and printing. But it only took us 18 years to go from radio broadcast, which is audio only, to television broadcast, which is not only writing only, but now you've got visuals and audio and even live television. If you look at different social media networks, it took Facebook and Twitter about 3 years to get to 250,000 users, so 25 million users rather. It took Google Plus 1 month to get to 25 million users. Of course, Google Plus didn't do very well, and we'll talk about that later, but nonetheless, you see rates of adoption flying quicker than ever before in today's technology areas. So don't forget that while technology changes at a faster and faster pace, people generally don't. And that's a discussion of Christakis and Fowler from a couple chapters ago. We use it for very human pursuits and very human goals. And perhaps one of the ways to think about these technology developments and whether they're going to be successful or not is thinking about the extent to which people can integrate them into the goals they have for their lives, the information and relationship and persuasion and entertainment goals that are going on in here. One of the things we might think about with technology is the notion of a cyborg. And I'm going to go somewhere with this in terms of how we've integrated tools into our lives today. But oftentimes, when we talk about cyborgs, we tend to mean very negative things. It's the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator, who is not quite human, but not quite robotic, but he's sort of like a flesh and blood thing that also has a computer chip. And so he's always seen as very cold and very rational and not very emotional. Um, cyborgs are these biological, systems that have a mechanical or digital element to them, and we tend to think that cyborgs, by definition, can't be human. And then I bring up the photo in the center, and this is a veteran from a war who came back from the Middle East and lost his arm. And so the United States military and the Veterans Association, they put some research and time and money and patience into helping him get used to using a robotic arm. Now, by the definition of a cyborg, he would be robotic. And if we call him a cyborg, we might argue that he's less than human, that he's missing a piece of himself, that he has an autonomic system that's part of his biological system, and therefore he's somehow less than human. But I bet that many of you would probably not see it that way. I sincerely think that we would not likely approach this man and call him less than human. In fact, some might argue he's more than human. Some might even suggest that he's more than human in the sense that he's probably been through more pain and loss and human experience than any of us likely listening to this presentation have ever had. And he's lived to tell the tale, and he's actually lived to have an arm and to not have an arm. And so it calls to question, are cyborgs automatically less than human, or do technologies take us away from our humanity? Is humanity simply having all of your human bits? And we'll talk about how this may not necessarily be a very relevant assumption for us to make. Some people argue this notion of technological determinism. It says that technology is the thing that influences society. That, this idea that if we use social media, then we become less connected to each other. Or if we start printing things down on paper, then we start becoming a society that reads things rather than writing things or listening to things. The other perspective is the social shaping of technology, and it's an argument that suggests that society is actually the thing that influences technology, that we need certain things out of our tools, and as a result of needing those things, we make technology to satisfy those goals. And what I point to here is an interesting dance between technology and humanity that we need to have a better understanding of. And you notice the graphic here is this notion of time. Well, time is a technology. It was a system developed to help us track our day, to help us organize ourselves, that will allow us to sort of get through our daily trials and tribulations. Talking about time a bit more, one of my favorite books, Natural Born Cyborgs, written by Andy Clark, he talks about the invention of the wristwatch. In many ways, sort of being an idea of a cyborg. And if you think about it, we have this device we wear on our wrists, and it tells us what time it is outside, and or what time it is, period. And for most people, if you were to ask them what time, do you know the time? They say, yeah. But if you think about it, they're lying to you. They don't know what time it is at all. But what we do have is a device on our wrists that can quickly tell us what time it is. And so therefore, I functionally know what time it is when you ask me, Dr. Bowman, what time is it? Well, if you think about how we defined a cyborg is somebody who has a biological system, a human flesh and blood body, but is using technologies to augment that flesh and blood body, to augment the very things that we do. And so if you think about what time really is, it's tracking a discrete moment in the universe. We typically think about it in terms of the number of times the Earth rotates around its own axis or rotates around the sun. And we use this because we know that things like 6 a.m. typically suggest very early. The sun's not very high in the sky right now. It's usually much cooler. Most humans are sleeping because it's rather dark outside. Or, we might say 12 o'clock p.m. We're referring here to the point in which the sun is usually the highest in the sky, And because the sun is the highest in the sky, that's usually the time when it's very hot outside. Traditionally, we take a break from our work, sit down, get some shelter, get some food, plot the rest of our day. Everybody's up to doing something. We use these different distinctions to help us organize our days. And by organizing our days, we could do things like I'm going to sleep at this time, I'm going to eat at this time, I'm going to work at this time, I'm going to have lunch, then I'm going to work some more, then I'm going to spend time with my family, then I'm going to go to bed and rest for the next day. Well, that's basically how most of us live in a modern society. And it might be argued that the wristwatch helped us become more human. You can imagine, for example, that it may be very difficult for us to truly organize our lives as we have them today had we not invented this notion of time and had we not invented this wristwatch to help us track the time. Because the only thing a watch is good for is telling you what time it is. But knowing what time it is kind of irrelevant if you don't have a notion of time. And this isn't to say that time's the most important thing or that all societies have a sense of time, but it's an argument that we've been using machines in our lives for a very long time. We've had sundials and wristwatches and pocket watches and smartwatches for several thousand years. And you can track our ability to harness and understand time with our abilities to be productive in the world around us. And if you want to read more on his book, I believe there are versions of it available online, as well as in your textbook, to kind of explain this notion of time in a bit more detail. And I'd encourage you to read up on that. Essentially, we might argue that technology is humanity. We are our tools. And this image here is from a very famous movie called Space Odyssey 2001. And a scene or a series of scenes referred to as the dawn of man. And you can watch the YouTube video linked here or also linked in your textbook. But what essentially shows is a group of chimpanzees gathering around a hunting ground. And they're fighting with these other animals to get to food, to get to water, to get to all sorts of different types of things in their environment. And essentially, the chimpanzees learn how to use weapons. They find old bones from animals they've eaten in the past, and they start to realize that these bones can actually be used to hit things. And if you hit things, you become more powerful. And the chimpanzees eventually exercise dominance over these sort of pig creatures. They sort of take over the watering hole, so to speak. They get stronger as a result. They organize their hunting around their weapons. They kind of outsmart the pigs and outmuscle the pigs. And it's a bit of a strange a scene. In fact, the scene ends with the bone being thrown into the air and then transforming into a spaceship. But the point that the director Stanley Kubrick was trying to make in these scenes is that technologies are sort of part of who we are. And of course, you could debate sort of the cultural criticisms of maybe it's the case that we become violent and things of this nature. And I don't dispute that, but the idea is that hunting allowed those chimpanzees to be the tribe that they eventually became to be known as throughout their culture. And you know, if you subscribe to the notions of evolution, they would have grown from that into basically what we are today, hence the bone turning into a spaceship. And so I encourage you to watch that video linked in your book on your own time, and perhaps comment on eCampus, like, what does it mean to say technology is humanity? As we've already seen in Christakis and Valor's comments, I think we've mentioned this earlier, but technologies like the printing press and the telephone and the internet don't take us away from our past. They actually kind of bring us closer to it. And things like the wristwatch and things like hunting technologies and fire and in social media, for example, where we're actually spending time communicating with each other. I mean, these are things that we've sort of been born to do, but for various rights and reasons, we're not always able to communicate. And technologies like social media sort of help that process along. Some people even argue that our brains are actually wired to be cyborgs or cybernetic. And two of the concepts here, one of them is the notion of neuroplasticity. It's the idea that the human brain has a remarkably clever function to where the different neural networks, the different neurons that connect to each other to help us live our lives and help us do the many things we have to do to survive are not only connected to each other, but they can break and reconnect to form new connections. For example, once we start thinking about the notion of time, our brains start to think about things as having a beginning and an end. And that causes us to actually restructure the way we might organize our thoughts and our thoughts and the knowledge we have. Another one's called the extended mind. And anybody who's taking notes right now on a piece of paper is already engaging in this process. The extended mind is an idea where we take parts of our mind, parts of our brain, and we put them down in other spaces. For example, taking notes is a way in which we remember things so that our brains don't have to store information. I still have notebooks going back to my undergraduate days in college where I could pull up those notebooks, go through my notes in that early political science lecture, and I could actually get a pretty good idea, so long as I wasn't doodling in the margins or drawing, love letters to people, as to what was going on in class that day. So note taking is an example we do this. Right now, I'm actually stationed over in Germany, teaching courses for the university, and I've got a piece of paper in my hand that tells me how to get to the train station. It's got the time, the train number, the platform number, the connection trains, and the phone numbers. That way I don't have to remember this. And some people say, oh, well, writing things down is very lazy. Why don't you just memorize it? And my response is, well, if I write everything down on a piece of paper, that frees my mind up to focus on other things while I'm traveling. And it's very much the same for a lecture. By taking notes during a lecture, you can actually put your pencil down and listen to the professor or listen to your students or ask questions. And so in both situations, we're using technologies to augment our humanity. We're using pieces of paper. We're using mental structures to help us learn better. We're being cyborgic. We can also think about things in terms of how transparent and opaque they are. So as we pick up more and more technologies, one of the things we often think about is how we take up those technologies. And so, for example, an opaque technology is one that while you're using it, it's very obvious you're using a technology. You've got something in your hand, you're staring at it, you're pushing buttons. And the idea behind an opaque technology is it's meant to take your attention. So if anybody listening to this lecture drives a manual transmission car, it's meant to be more opaque. When you drive a manual transmission car, that is a car where you have to shift your own gears. You've got to pay attention to the sounds of the engine. You've got to kind of pay attention to what gear your car is in to make it operate at the right speed and the right fuel efficiency without hurting your engine and things like this. Some people argue that it takes more of your attention to drive that car, which tends to make people perhaps better drivers. At least the argument would go that it focuses you on driving, not on other things. If you're driving an automatic transmission car, the idea is the car largely drives itself, which means you can focus on other things. Now, that could be traffic and directions and attention in the environment, but of course it could also be talking to other people in the car and things of this nature. And this is the balance between transparent and opaque technology. Transparent technology, if we were to use video game controllers, would be like the Microsoft Kinect. You move your hands, and as soon as you move your hands, things happen on screen. You don't even have to think about it. And in fact, it should be the case where the technology is so transparent that all you have to focus on is hitting the bowling pins or swinging a sword or aiming at a guy. Whereas in opaque technology, you spend so much time focused on the technology that you might not actually focus on what you're supposed to be doing with the technology. Now, of course, both are good things. You can imagine if we had a nuclear warhead attached to a controller like on the right screen here, if that were the example, it would be good to make sure it's an opaque technology. We don't want somebody sort of accidentally firing a weapon or accidentally stopping an airplane. So opaque technologies are often found in places where the technology is kind of the important thing, where the task is supposed to sort of slow you down a little bit. Transparent technologies are often found in places where the technology is simply a barrier to the experience, right? And so one thing I might ask you to think about on the eCampus discussions is, what is Facebook? Do you find Facebook to be a transparent technology or an opaque technology? And I'd like you to sort of justify your answer in those discussions. Opaque technologies can become transparent with practice. Those of you who drive stick shift transmissions or manual transmissions would likely tell me that to you, it feels pretty natural. You've been driving it long enough to where it's not that strange, and you don't even really think about the gears anymore. You don't look down at the console to make sure you're in the right gear because you know how it works, right? We see this a lot in video games, where as we go through people playing the games, they become sort of more and more transparent. When folks first start using video game controllers, they often struggle with the controller. But after using the controller for a long time, they don't even really think about it anymore. Um, as we already mentioned, we can use technology to scaffold our minds. We can take notes in class so we don't have to remember what we heard. Taking notes is rather opaque, but it makes the lecture more transparent. And in a way, we are our tools. Transparent tools are essentially part of us. That wristwatch you carry around, or your phone, or whatever you use to tell the time, that is a transparent technology that is sort of part of your daily life. It's part of who you are. It's in some ways what you use to maybe get through the day into the next day. You don't walk around counting the number of times the Earth has revolved around its axis, because if we did that, we wouldn't have time to do anything else, which is why a wristwatch is particularly good for tracking the time. I mentioned scaffolding a little bit, and one of the things we think about when we talk about the functional role of communication technology is trying to combine the things that humans do best with the things that machines do best. Wristwatches are really good for tracking how much the Earth has moved around its axis. Humans are really good at solving clever puzzles, or picking up patterns in discussions, or stopping and smelling the roses. And one of my favorite examples of this notion of scaffolding is this program called CAPTCHA. And anybody who's ever gone onto a website where you had to purchase something or register for an account, you might actually have had to fill out one of these validation or verification softwares. And often what they're trying to do is verify that you're a real person and not a robot. What we know from human-computer interaction studies is robots aren't particularly good at recognizing words. They can recognize words when they're typed into a computer, but if you show a robot a picture of a book, it oftentimes can't read the book because the fonts aren't really optimized for a machine. Remember, when you type into a computer, your typing is converted into a series of ones and zeros that mean different symbols. If I show somebody a picture, unless the computer actually has a database of that language and that font and those pages, it doesn't know what those symbols actually mean. It's why even today in Google, it's very difficult to search for images. You can type in a word and search for an image, but it's very difficult to upload an image to a computer and say, find out what this plant is. Our databases aren't quite there yet. So what CAPTCHA does is it takes books, it scans them, and then it gives them to humans, and it distorts the words. And the idea is that when the human user logs onto a system, they type in what they think the word is. And so the example here, you'd probably type in the word upon and the word between. You hit enter, that goes to a database. What you're actually doing is helping teach computers how to read, because the idea is if thousands of people get those two distorted words and they all type in upon and between, it tells the computer that whenever you see an image that looks like this, what you're actually seeing are the words upon and between. We're using the human's ability to sort of discern between novel patterns to help machines sort through large databases and read large bits of information. And of course, the help here for society is that we can begin to scan books and hopefully take our knowledge that's written, put it in the databases. And then you think back to our earlier lectures about this notion of compression. We can start putting knowledge in places where we couldn't get to it before. The digitization, and we had talked about conversion and convergence and transferring files and things like that. So scaffolding is really the key of Chapter 3. And it's what do humans do? What do machines do? And how can we work together to essentially be good cyborgs? How can we make more wristwatches but that do other things? We can also think about what's called uses and gratifications theory. It's one of the reasons by which we use technology, right? And we can break down the ways we approach technologies roughly into these three notions of needs, uses, and effects. We need things. We need to know the news. We need to know what our friends are doing. We want to know what's happening in the news today. We want to know the weather outside. Those needs can be individual, just personal. They can be social needs, things about the people around us. They could be environmental needs, things about our physical world. And the notion is that those needs often predict what technologies we use. If I need to know if my friends are busy tonight, I might hop on Facebook and ask them. If I need to know a recipe for cookies, I might hop onto a shopping channel or a recipe channel or a cooking show. If I want to know what the weather is outside, I might go to weather.com or just stick my head out the window or check the newspaper for the forecast last week. Well, of course, when we use technology, we're affected by it, right? So I might hop online to find out what my friends are talking about. And as a result, I feel closer to my friends. But then also a lot of them are being very rude. So I get quite upset about it. Someone cusses me out online for my opinion. Or somebody, makes fun of my mother or, shows a lot of really, really sort of racially insensitive posts, and that offends me. So these effects can be intended and unintended. And the model here, uses of gratifications, isn't all that novel, but the idea behind the model is that we can understand how technology affects us by understanding the reasons that we use technology. A slide from your book would say the social and psychological origin of our needs generate expectations of the technology. Those expectations of technology drive our exposure. Our exposure results in our needs being satisfied, but then we also have other things that happen to us as a result. And this very simple model of media uses and effects can be used to explain how these technology tools might have a rather drastic effect on us. For example, let's say that a child is really bored in school, and so we have this girl here, and she's staring at her pencil because she's just bored out of her mind. She might choose to play an extremely violent video game, because the video game with a lot of violence is very arousing, it's very exciting, it's a lot of fun. Things come after her, she goes after those things. It's definitely not boring. And so on the one hand, she might feel like really, really, really positive, and she won the game, and she's really excited now. She's having a good time. She's happy with herself. And that was the intended effect, to not be bored and to maybe feel effective. But of course, the unintended effect could be maybe she's really into guns now. She's really into shooting things now. And perhaps she wants to shoot more things as a result. Maybe the next time she gets bored, she grabs a gun instead of doing something else that might be seen by others as potentially more healthy. And while I don't want to necessarily go into a gun debate here, the idea is her intention was not to learn how to use guns, but that might have happened. This is the fundamental model of sort of media uses and effects, and we'll talk about the specific entertainment effects in chapters 12 and 13. But this example here shows how our needs impact our uses. Our need for, not being bored might cause us to play an exciting video game. But that exciting video game might have both an intended and an unintended effect, and we can talk about that in terms of how we understand our media tools. Where all of this goes is a debate that we've had raging, I think, in communication studies and media psychology in these fields, is that we tend to assume that face-to-face communication is the gold standard of communication. The technologies make us cyborgs, make us robotic, and it's always best to talk to people face-to-face, that Facebook friends aren't real friends. And I want to hear what you think about that. And so I'd like you to go to eCampus and tell me what you think face-to-face communication is particularly good for, and then what you think computer-mediated communication is particularly good for. And I'd like to know, do you think that face-to-face communication is the gold standard of communication? It's the thing that is always best for communication. Because I want to engage this discussion as we go through the week online. Some would argue that blaming technology for sort of making us less human doesn't quite make sense. There's a great book called Let the Great World Spin by Colin McCann, and it's a science fiction novel where they have these machines that kind of slowly sort of, I guess, take over society. And I won't give you any spoilers, so I'll let you read this on your own. But I always love this quote from the book. There's a battle going on with these peace protesters, and they were trying to break the machines of the government. They thought if we break the machines, the government will fall and everything will be okay. And doesn't work that way, because it's not the machines that were evil, but it was the minds of the people behind them. Because a machine can do no more harm or no more evil than a violin or a camera or a pencil. And McCann's discussion here is that we often blame the growth of technology as sort of a reason why humans aren't doing a very good job of being human. And McCann's arguments and many other scholars argue that that doesn't really take into account how we use technology. In other words, it takes out the human component and sort of suggests that technologies sort of only have like one role or one feature in society. And that might not quite make sense. And we'll discuss this as we go through. But, suggesting that Facebook has made us all narcissistic sort of assumes that we weren't narcissistic before Facebook, and that every time we post about ourselves on Facebook, we're being a narcissist, we're bragging about ourselves, we're showing off ourselves. And that might not be accurate. In fact, some people would argue that programs like Facebook allow us to communicate the sort of mundane parts of our lives in ways we never could before. It turns out that knowing what your friend had for breakfast yesterday morning is kind of interesting, or you wouldn't read it. And so we'll talk about this as we go through the semester. In conclusion for Chapter 3, media matters to people because mediated experiences are real. And media technologies are tools. It's really hard to say whether they're good or bad because they're technologies. And we might suggest that face-to-face communication should not really be the gold standard of human interaction. But perhaps it's just what we're used to. And it's very transparent for us. We know how to communicate face-to-face. For some of these other technologies, we don't quite know how to use them just yet. So, as always, I invite you to take your thoughts on eCampus, but I also invite several of you to go online, to go to some of your social media tools and tell us, are social media programs more opaque or transparent technologies? What needs are you able to gratify by using social media? And give us an example of how you may have used social media to scaffold your brain. You can share your answers to these questions on Twitter using the Media as Tool hashtag, or in the official Facebook group with the link listed below. Media as tools, not media as tool. Again, I thank you for your time, and I'll see you in the next chapter.